Thank you for joining us.
Oh, brilliant. Thank
Yeah,
you.
really appreciate it. This is fun. I don't know how much Whitney mentioned, but I used to have a podcast, which I stopped about a year ago, but we continued our podcast book club. So I miss talking to people, authors, etc., on the podcast. So this was a really fun way to kind of keep that going through the
Well,
book
I'm
club. So
grateful,
yeah.
to you and your colleagues for reading the book. I was very touched when Whitney told me that it was your book club choice. I hope you've been enjoying it. I hope you're finding it useful. I'm seated at the very table where I wrote the thing, actually. A lot of 14-hour days spent at this table, um, working very assiduously. And it was a hugely meaningful experience for me to write the book. It grew out of a class, an online class that I was delivering to the Theosophical Society in America, and it proved very popular. And then I got down to the business of considering whether to make it into something more permanent. And for any of you who have ever written by way of transcription, you know how quickly that entire plan goes south. It's almost more difficult to write uh, from transcription than it is to write just sui generis, from your own thoughts. And so at a certain point in the process, I found myself dispensing entirely with transcripts, although following more or less the order of the classes in each of the 12 chapters. Each of the 12 chapters sticks with the original classes that we began. And it's so funny when you work on a book of this type, you have these instances where at some inopportune moment, you realize what you've forgotten. I finished the book and I was at Trader Joe's and I was on the checkout line and I saw one of the checkout people who I knew and said, "Hey, what's up? I just finished this massive book, Modern Occultism." And she said, "Oh, is Mother Shipton in there?" And I was like, "That would be no." And then I realized to my horror one night I had left out the great artist Alejandro Jodorowsky, who I'm sure some of you know. And it's funny, you do your best to be all encompassing. And what I realized from very early on, probably starting with my first book, Occult America, where I do feel that I made some very serious omissions. Um, the effort has to be to cover themes rather than every individual or every event, because something or someone is always going to get away from you, regardless of how hard you try to be comprehensive. Comprehension will always elude you, just as I used to tell authors back in my publishing days. Don't chase headlines. Headlines are always going to outstrip you. If you think you have a great idea, then unless something really seismic occurs, you should be able to endorse and write about that great idea without necessarily worrying about what's going to come out in the news 2 or 3 or 4 weeks from now, because at least in the old days, between the final submission of a book and its actual publication, easily 9 months would pass. So events are always going to occur that outstrip whatever you're working on. And likewise, in matters of comprehensiveness, history is always going to provide some fold or nook or cranny that occurs to you, while you're on the checkout line. But I've been very happy with the book. I've been very happy with the response to it. Um, it forced me out of my comfort zone because I think that there were people and ideas that I really hadn't comprehensively come to grips with, and I couldn't allow myself to bypass them. Like, for example, the esoteric teacher, Alice Bailey, is a figure that's very, very important to a lot of people. And she was very important to the development of alternative spiritual structures here in our country and still has a lot of followers. And I realized at a certain point that I really had never sat down with Bailey's oeuvre, which is very dense, and gotten my hands dirty with it. And there were a lot of figures for whom that was the case. For example, um, the process church. They were a very radically challenging esoteric movement, possessed of some very brilliant ideas theologically, possessed of just tremendous qualities aesthetically, and they were, in a way, the most challenging, most dangerous variant, in a sense, of the counterculture of the late 60s, early 70s. And I had found it easy at a certain point to skip past process, but I knew that that was a cop out, and I needed to dive all the way deep into the pool to learn what they were about. And it was hugely educative, but also very contentious, because for a lot of, well, not a lot, but it doesn't take much to accomplish anything online nowadays. It doesn't have to be a lot of people. For some people online, process, which has really not been around since the early 1980s. They're now an animal shelter organization in Utah. And by all accounts, they do very good work on animal rescue. But process is possessed of a very complicated theology that straddles between, frankly, Christianity and Satanism, and they try to marry these polarities in their own way, and it's very brilliant and original. But there's a subculture out there that is persuaded that process is responsible for everything horrible that's ever happened in our world, from the Son of Sam serial killings in New York City to mass disappearances of innocents, persisting today. And it's all just fantasy. It's all the seeking of a boogeyman and finding one, as we almost always do, rather than just dealing with the social complexities and crises and problems of our world. And frankly, rather than dealing with accident and tragedy. And I was shocked to find that some of the very countercultural figures who I read about towards the end of the book, including Michael Aquino, who had been part of the Church of Satan and later branched off and founded his own Temple of Set. He died very recently. He died of cancer. Um, and there is a conspiratorial subculture online that posits, again, Aquino-like process is sort of the dark force behind everything shitty that's ever happened in our world. And as it happens, Aquino's mother was involved in um, pioneering gifted and talented programs in public schools. So the idea now is that, well, gifted and talented programs are themselves a conspiracy, and we have to crack open the secrets behind these things. None of it's true, and none of it seeks to contend with the theologies of these figures. And one of the things I came to feel is that if a person is interested in different modes of living, different modes of spirituality, different ways of engaging with the world, that's going to entail paddling into rapids sometimes and encountering ideas and people and things in these rapids that might not always be appealing, or that might even be questionable. But as I've often said to people, a lot of things that we take for granted in our world today, very mainstream practices like yoga or macrobiotic eating or even mind-body medicine, these ideas, which today are so mainstream and so widely practiced, tended to enter our culture through the fringes. And that, as much as it seems really cool and interesting that Steve Jobs took LSD when he was designing Apple, the earliest nascence of LSD and its uses, both positively and negatively, came up through subcultures that were not always so comfortable, not always so easy. Likewise, yoga, things that are so domestic and familiar nowadays, sometimes came through the influence of groups that were considered very weird and very way out 100 years ago. So if we neglect voices maybe closer to our own generation because they seem weird or off-putting or frankly even threatening, we may be neglecting vessels through which alternative ideas that are helpful to a lot of people flow. So I tried to hold myself to the standards of not avoiding any people or topics or movements that were either radically unfamiliar to me or that had a very checkered reputations. If I could identify them within the framework of occultism, then I felt they deserved a place in the book. Some movements, like maybe branched off into directions that are just unclassifiable, like Scientology. So I deal with L. Ron Hubbard, for example, when he was bouncing around occult subcultures in the late 1940s, early 1950s, before he decided he had better ideas and went off and did his thing. Past a certain point, I don't view him as part of occult tradition, but he was there with Jack Parsons, bopping around Pasadena and experimenting with things, and that has to be noted. That has to be noted. So I also tried to hold myself to the standard of going way back in history and saying, look, a lot of what we experience in our world today as a cult probably goes to very late antiquity, Egyptian antiquity, around the time of Cleopatra forward. And after Cleopatra's death, ancient Egypt, unfortunately, really no longer functioned as an independent entity. It became a Roman commonwealth, more or less a Roman colony, and remained so for centuries. But things that you'll find in the very late ancient experience, certain writings, are among the few things that have survived from very deep antiquity, hopefully providing us with a time capsule of what some of the real primeval ancients were thinking about. But when it comes to spiritual practice, we have philosophical tracts, but in terms of works of magic, ceremony, rite, ritual, a lot of that stuff was destroyed as the monotheistic religions, particularly Christianity and Islam, really spread throughout the Western world. So much was destroyed. We retained so precious little. Libraries at Alexandria and Constantinople were destroyed in wars and conflagrations, and obviously there was a great deal of persecution. Stuff gets stolen, it gets pirated, it gets neglected, it gets burned. So the precious fragments that we have tend to be stuff that was from late antiquity, and we can only assume, well, probably this material has a lineage that's older than that. But I felt I had to start at late antiquity because the ideas that we have only fragments of the old religions, the religions of Persia, Egypt, Rome, Greece, they exist in fragments from the late ancient world. So I started there, and then this stuff again vanished during the so-called Dark Ages, where a lot of it was probably lost again, and it got picked up again through fragments during the Renaissance. And so you had the Hermetic manuscripts, and then there was a discrediting, and again, a long fallow period, which some people call the Age of Enlightenment. Perhaps I'm wrong to call it a fallow period. I'm being a little subjective. But you had the fallow period of the Age of Enlightenment, where occult ideas were really considered just absolutely verboten. They lingered, but they were quieted. They were very, very, very seriously quieted until the occult revivals of the mid to late 19th century, the work of Eliphas Levi and Madame H.P. Blavatsky. And after that, occultism really has become a very modern phenomenon, mixed in with different philosophies and ideas. And one of the things I always say to people is that simply because something is old doesn't mean that it's good or that it's true, and simply because something is new doesn't mean that it's fickle or without weight or gravitas. There are going to be new traditions. There are going to be old objects like tarot, for example, to which people bring new ideas and new traditions. I think tarot, to cite an example, it goes back historically to the early Renaissance, where it was more of a household game, and that term game always ruffles people because it sounds frivolous. But I think that even into the medieval era, people didn't use terms like game in a frivolous way any more than we would say a play, a drama is frivolous because we're calling it a play. Or if we're saying an actor plays a part, we're not saying that person is just engaged in an entertainment or a pastime. You know, there's a great seriousness to it. The term game has aged poorly, so I'm thinking maybe there's a better word to use because it turns people off. They feel it's trivializing, but I would contend it's not trivializing because in earlier eras where people had so few household possessions, everything was imbued with meaning. This was certainly true in antiquity, and I think it persisted until the medieval and Renaissance eras. Um, and then it was in the late 1700s, again, deep into the Age of Enlightenment, that tarot was sort of remade as a divinatory tool. And personally speaking, I believe it has validity as a divinatory tool. I use it as a divinatory tool. And a person can do that. A person can do that while also understanding its history and that tarot, like a lot of things, is more modern than we realize. Um, Even say the liturgy in the Jewish religion, the Jewish liturgy, beautiful as it is, pretty much is medieval in origin. It doesn't go, all the way back to King Solomon and the temple, and they were doing a lot different things then, sacrificing bulls. And when Judaism became more of like a wandering tradition, a new liturgy was necessary. They didn't have the ancient temple anymore, and they were trying to figure out, well, how do we keep it together? So there were rabbinical writings like Kabbalah, or the liturgy that gets used today. And again, that liturgy, beautiful as it is, and though everything stands on ancient foundations, it's not that old. It's medieval, more or less. Um, so it was interesting embarking on the journey of this book. You realize that some things in our world that we think of as ancient, venerable, primeval are newer than we may think. But that doesn't mean they're without validity. And I think that novelty has always been a facet of religion. And um, and and religions will go through phases, whether established religions like Catholicism or more free-form traditions like the occult will go through phases where something is more out of favor. Saint veneration in Catholicism was more out of favor during Vatican II. And then John Paul came in and he starts minting saints like there's no tomorrow. And suddenly saint veneration is very, very popular again within the church. And I think occultism is that way as well. Stuff, it kind of fades, but then maybe there's some super exciting new translation, and something else happens. I think we're probably going through a period like that right now with regard to astrology because um, so many. It's funny, we think that we found everything there is to be found and it's all nicely cataloged somewhere, but there are new texts that haven't been translated from Hellenic antiquity, sometimes in Greek, sometimes in Latin, that are astrological. And the last time I went for an astrology reading, my astrologer, who's a very learned guy, was doing stuff that I didn't relate to at all, and that frankly I didn't feel super comfortable with because I grew up, as probably many of you did, if you're interested in astrology, with some of the standard, Placidus readings and with an understanding of Vedic astrology, but some of the most popular methods used in Western astrology, they kind of get into your skin, almost like a religious system. You're not going to listen to somebody tell you, Christmas is February 5th. You didn't know that? Everybody knows that, but you find these challenging new pieces of material and it can knock you back on your heels because we like the familiar. I like the familiar. And and I think we might be going through a phase like that now where we're going to start to see some real differences in astrological practice because of these new translations. Project Hindsight is doing a lot to translate these things and make them available. And likewise, Gnosticism is exploding today, and there Gnostic themes appear in our most popular movies. I think the first 20 minutes of the Barbie movie I thought was one of the best popularizations of Gnosticism I've ever seen. Everything is going just fine until Barbie starts having thoughts about death, and then she realizes she's not really alive, and suddenly everything starts fraying and coming apart. It's a very Gnostic viewpoint, and uh, as I'm sure some of you know, some very key Gnostic texts and Gospels were discovered towards the end of World War II at Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Um, they were discovered by a family of farmers who just kind of kept them in their house and then thought, well, maybe we'll sell them, maybe we'll do something else with them. They were kept by a stove, and miraculously, they were found. And and so that gave birth to this kind of modern renaissance in Gnosticism, where it's now a topic of conversation that's, I wouldn't say mainstream, but pretty widely felt. Um, Whereas in the 1700s, when the term Gnosticism was coined, it was kind of pejorative, and there weren't very many scholars walking around who thought that these Mediterranean sects who combined paganism and Christianity and Judaism, they were just thought of as this very eccentric moment in late antiquity, not something that modern people needed. But today, in the 21st century, this feeling that we're living in an ersatz world has very deep resonance with Gnosticism. And the tech bros will call it what do they call it? A simulacrum. We're living in this simulacrum world. Elon Musk speaks about that. Whereas the more spiritual people will say, like, we're asleep. We're asleep to our own experience. We're living under these kind of false authorities, false illusions. And then you see this theme populating movies like, most obviously, Matrix, but also Truman Show, Barbie. And Barbie was pretty remarkable because it showed in both China and Saudi Arabia, and that was not true of Truman Show and Matrix. So, without sort of announcing itself as, hey, we're a Gnostic movie, and maybe without even claiming that, without even claiming that. I mean, if the director were here, she might say, I don't even know what you're talking about. But those are Gnostic themes that you see in that movie, living in this world that it's not reality. And there's something else. And there's problems that start to show up. There's fissures that start to show up that make the searching person very uncomfortable. So for me, that movie was the most extraordinary popularization of Gnosticism ever, not only because it was super popular within the US, but because it was popular in China and Saudi, which I find almost unthinkable. So these themes are so interesting because they endure, they go away, they go underground, they get forgotten. But then sometimes there's a discovery, and they're back. And so in that sense, modern, ancient, it's all this interplay. But I do think it helps us as seekers, as just people interested in the world, to know our own history and to know, hey, this is not as old as it seems, or that the kind of astrology that we might do today is not the same astrology that was being done in ancient Mesopotamia. It's very different, but yet the coordinates are there. And it's incredible to me that you almost can't meet anybody who doesn't know his or her sun sign and something about it. And that's a really surprising religious retention. There's a lot of religious retentions that we have not hung on to, and that we have. And it's fascinating to me how certain things, maybe because they resonate with human experience, which I would personally say of astrology, stick around, whereas other things, like applying leeches to ourselves, do not stick around. And we, as a human community, tend to sort through these things, sometimes across millennia, and it's fascinating to see what endures, what doesn't endure. And I find it enchanting to know where we come from. Enchanting that Notre Dame is built on the foundation of ancient pagan temples. Extraordinary that you'll find these different admixtures of religion that were efforts on the part of late ancient people to hang on to some of the old practices. And we have within our own world the challenge of reassembling some of the ancient practices in ways that are meaningful and legit, but that require adaptation because we just don't have that much material from the ancient world. We kind of think we do, but when we actually get down to it in terms of the Hermetic texts and so on, there's precious little, and we know so little about these things and how they've reached us. Like I think I remarked somewhere in the book that even the original Greek scrolls that were translated into Latin and then later on Latin into English that make up the what we call the Hermetica or the Corpus Hermeticum. We don't have the original scrolls. Nobody knows where they are. They might have been destroyed. They might have been thrown away. They might have gotten wrecked in a fire or a war or something. Just no one knows. So we're in this disadvantageous position of not even knowing what they say. And there's no doubt that people over millennia, centuries, have added stuff to them, taken stuff out, maybe added things that seem more familiar, more reassuring, took out things that were difficult to understand. So it has to also be humbling too that we just we possess so little. I mean, when you think about it, the scrolls that were translated from late Egyptian Greek antiquity that form the basis for occultism, um, they're gone, they're lost. There's no museum case that you can point to and say, well, there they are. We don't even know what they said, and what got lost. Which is why I think everyone, for example, who considers him or herself a religious traditionalist should take a deep breath because if we want to speak in terms of traditionalism, again, it depends what comes down to us. Um, but I think I'll stop there. It was such a great experience writing this book. I mean, it was a dream come true. And I'll say this. I'll close on this note, and this is just a personal note. It's a dream that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for a tragedy. Um, Shortly just before the pandemic began, um, I was working on a treatment and a pilot for a television show based on my first book, Occult America. And I wanted to do this more than anything in the world. And the sizzle reel was great, and the everything was great, and we had big producers who were raring to go. And one member of the production team just went batshit, went off the rails, as things not infrequently go in screen work, because it's a very high risk, very high reward kind of undertaking, and it drives people batshit, frankly. And if you can get through production on anything without somebody going batshit, count yourself really lucky. So one of the core producers went batshit, and he started threatening everybody and threatening lawsuits, and it was utterly heartbreaking. And as soon as stuff like that happens, projects go away, and producers and networks just say to themselves, next, and they're on to the next thing. And so it fell apart. And I was devastated. I was profoundly sad. And I had a lot of nights where I felt a sense of real despair. But I must say the following. If if that hadn't occurred, we wouldn't be having this exchange right now, because the very fact that that show got derailed is what led me into doing the course. The course led me into doing the book. And without having done the book, I would feel a serious gap in my life. Now, it so happens I'm on another TV show right now called Alien Encounters, which has to do with UFOs and non-human intelligences and so forth. It's on the Discovery Channel. It's on tomorrow night. And I love it. And it was a great experience and a wonderful experience. And nobody went batshit, and the thing got done. And it was wonderful. So, it came back around in a different way. But if the sorrow hadn't been experienced, and I would have given anything to reverse the situation, but if the sorrow hadn't been experienced, this thing never would have gotten written. And that would represent a gap, for me. So I just want to put that out there, kind of person to person. I do believe there is a compensatory element in our world. And when we suffer something, whether it's a relationship falling apart or work project or whatever it is, uh, I really do believe there is a compensatory element out there. And this book was mine. So I thank you all, and I'm very happy if anybody has any questions that I can respond to.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you.
Amazing. Who
Thank
wants to go first with questions? I've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, I've got some too, but I want to give
You're
y'all
the
the floor.
expert. Tanya. You go first.
Well, I guess I was super interested at the very end that I was sort of, as I was reading the book, and I think most of us probably finished the book. We read it over the past couple of months and had one discussion about the first half a month ago. But as I was finishing the book, I was sort of surprised because I think as I was reading it, I was like, okay, like all this stuff happened, da, 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 and then like the New Age. And so I was
Yeah.
sort of surprised at that, your description of the New Age as different than the occult, sort of like likening the New Age to Gaia, or being represented by Gaia, or the occult being represented by Prometheus.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess I was curious to just have you talk a little bit more about that. Like, did the occult start out as counterculture, or did it become that way? And like those lines feel super blurry to me now. Like, where does astrology, for example, fit into that? Is it more New
Right.
Age or occult? Or so yeah, I just would love to hear you speak to that a bit.
I would say the lines are blurry and there's a great deal of overlap. I wouldn't want to draw too sharp a demarcation between the occult and the New Age because, like, for example, I move in and out of either culture. I would describe New Age as a radically ecumenical culture of therapeutic spirituality. That's New Age to me. And I have a lot of respect for New Age. I love New Age. I wouldn't be writing 3/4 of the books I'm writing if it weren't for that culture. So that might encompass recovery movements, that might encompass different liberal metaphysical congregations, that could encompass an interest in the work of, say, Edgar Cayce, could encompass, even though, some people like to draw very sharp lines between themselves and New Age because they think New Age is frivolity or fuzziness. I don't share that definition. I have found, though, and this has been a personal realization that sometimes come at some personal chagrin and even pain over the past several years of my life, there is more of a Judeo-Christian outlook in New Age. Also, I would say a Buddhist and a Westernized Hindu outlook. And I think that New Age can draw very sharp lines of demarcation between like what is considered like white or black magic or things like that. And I find those distinctions very counterproductive and very limiting of the search, because in a way that just replicates the orthodoxy that a lot of us might want to get away from in exploring alternative spiritual modalities. And I have found that certain pockets of the New Age do tend, maybe because they're so mass in popularity, maybe because human organization just lends itself to this, do tend to kind of create um, inside, outside, good, bad, black, white demarcations that remind me a lot of the kind of Abrahamic way of viewing the world. Maybe less so in Hinduism, maybe less so in Buddhism, but Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, pretty black and white, and in terms of, well, no, I mean, obviously, I'm being glib. I mean, they have their reform movements. You have reform movements within Islam, Judaism, Christianity, but the mainstream of those movements tends to be Abrahamic in nature. There's a very sharp demarcation as to what is and isn't kosher, verboten, acceptable, however a person wants to put it. I find some of that in New Age, but I also agree that there's a very porous relationship between occultism and New Age. I wouldn't want to draw a line of demarcation. It's different, it's different in that I find that occultism is, I think, probably less attached to the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, less maybe attached as well to Buddhism or Westernized Hinduism, more interested in drawing upon spell work, old and new, magical operations, Renaissance occultism, late ancient occultism, initiatory organizations like Freemasonry, or iconic figures like a Aleister Crowley or Madame Blavatsky, who's on my shirt. And so I think New Age has been a positive development. But I think it's grown parallel to occultism while sharing a very porous border with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, like quick response. I study and have taught astrology to, I would think, most people on this call. And I am very sort of often frustrated by the New Age interpretation or execution of astrology, often because of that sort of black and white, good, bad, cursed, not cursed overlay. And like for me, I feel like the whole point of astrology is that it's nuanced and symbolic and interpretive. So yeah, I feel like there's probably these traditions that are like straddling both of these things.
So, and it'll be a trope of New Age, and I mean this lovingly. But look, folks, sometimes the death card really is death. I mean, we can't always be, oh, you're so lucky. It's a chrysalis of rebirth. It's like nobody's like, yes, I got the death card. It's and New Age can be a little closed and problematic with some of these nuances.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who's next?
I'll go. I'll try not to have a full monologue here. But I think I don't even know where to start, because there's so many things. I think I'm going to start with the question I have, which is, you bring up Satanic Panic, and and 80s, so I was very much
I missed you. You cut out there.
The Satanic Panic taking over the southern small town I was in, and all the fear around these alternative ways of thinking. And yet my father's sect of religion is this highly ecstatic Pentecostal snake handling revival. And so coming, as I've grown up a seeker, I think I've dabbled in everything, a little bit here, a little bit there. I met my husband at the Omega Institute back in the mid 2000s. And when I got there, there was this thing of like, well, how did you wind up here? Because I really stuck out compared to all the New Age, hippie, Sufi, like mystical thing. I was like dressed in J. Crew, and I was interested in Kabbalah and DMT and visionary art, and my husband learned to paint from Alex Gray, and these sort of things like drew me in there. And then, but my only experience with astrology before I'd taken class with Anya was really like, do you remember the little plastic scrolls that would pop out when you in the front of diners back in the day? And like, I had to those, and of course, maybe that big book of birthdays where you would like look up someone you were dating and see if you were sun signs. And as a Scorpio who married a Gemini, it was always like, do not do this. I was like, how is that possible? And then Anya, of course, has illumined me to all the ways of astrology and how to see it, even from like a Jungian perspective. But I would like to know, speaking of the Satanic Panic, how you feel then about this return to this sort of QAnon, Baphomet is everywhere. Everyone thinks that it's like, the human trafficking and Satan. It's kind of like a neo-Satanic Panic.
Yes, I agree.
This
yeah. It's frustrating to me. I think that my response has been to try as much as possible to document Baphomet and the lives of some of the people who use that symbol. I think probably, look, if people are really hardcore ensconced in QAnon, they're unreachable. They're just absolutely unreachable. And I despair at seeing some of my friends and colleagues argue with these guys online because you're spitting in the wind. And um, there have to be other responses, and and those responses might come from a very wide variety of places. Um, I despair over the fact that this nation, everybody agrees on a lot of things. Like I doubt you'd find anybody who says, gee, the state of healthcare in America is just terrific. Let's leave things exactly as they are. Everybody agrees that healthcare is a horrible mess, that we're all getting ripped off by our insurance carriers, and pharmaceutical prices are outrageous, and this stuff can be fixed. It absolutely can be fixed. If we can lock down, 3/4 of the world for 2 years during the COVID crisis, we can fix pharmaceutical pricing. And besides, it's all just a question of it's a delivery system. Like you look at healthcare, private, public, it's a delivery system. What works? Um, and we don't fix these things because we're so culturally, or at least on social media and in the political realm, we're culturally divided. Whether we're as culturally divided as it really seems, I'm not so sure. I mean, when I was traveling around recently in New Mexico and Texas and other parts of the country, my partner's from Reno, Nevada, and you go to these different parts of the West, the Southwest, and I'm sure everybody's had this experience. You walk in a bar, restaurant, whatever. There's all kinds of different people hanging out. Black, white, different sexualities. Trans, or whatever, and everybody's hanging around at the same tables. I was at a UFO parade in Roswell several weeks ago, and Roswell's a very working class town, and you just see everybody hanging out, and you really stop thinking very quickly in terms of black, white, Hispanic, gay, straight, trans, cis, whatever. It kind of starts to fade, and I don't feel like we as people are very divided. It's just not that bad. But then you go on social media and you go into the political realm and it explodes, and things like QAnon really cement that. People like having an enemy. They like throwing rocks. It empowers them. It makes them feel great. I really question the extent to which there's a great deal of kind of perverse enjoyment in anger, addiction, rock throwing, violence, getting pissed off. Because, I mean, let's face it, there's selfishness is never in short supply in the human situation. And we do what we like. And so if people are rambling on about QAnon or Satanism or whatever, it's just because it's enjoyable as hell to have somebody to throw rocks at. And of course, if you wanted to help kids or whatever, you could do that. It's really hard. I mean, it's there's no easy solutions, but if you want to just watch a YouTube documentary about it, that's fun. Um, I and it's funny, you mentioned the background in Pentecostalism. Um, I've written and read a lot about I've written a lot about the televangelist Oral Roberts, who started off in a more Pentecostal charismatic background. And it was funny, a couple of years ago, University Press sent me a biography of Oral Roberts with a request that I do a cover blurb. And I said, I'm happy to, but are you sure you want my endorsement? And there it is. And although there might be like some political or cultural differences, I really am very interested in the Pentecostal and charismatic experience because, as I understand it, those worshipers are hungry for signs and wonders, snake handling, drinking of poison, speaking in tongues. And my feeling is right on. I don't want religion to be in a museum case. Are you getting something out of this? Is something happening in your life? the snobs can't imagine that there is. You know, the snobs are convinced that every prosperity ministry is just a bunch of sheep getting fleeced by this megalomaniac. And well, the truth is, I suspect that after years, people really wouldn't stick around if they didn't feel like they were getting something. Um, so I wish that there weren't so much in the way of cultural barriers, because I want to get down with those congregations. One of the best discussions I ever had about two of the best discussions I ever had about Satanism were on a podcast. One was a Mormon podcast, and one was Seventh-day Adventist. And those are conservative congregations, but they kind of have supernatural beliefs. So they're sort of interested in, you know, ancient alien theories and things like that. And they're like, oh, let's look at this, you know, kind of strange curio, and we'll talk to Horowitz about Satanism. And at least we're talking. At least we're talking. Whereas I find the QAnon people aren't talking to anybody but themselves. Yeah.
On that same note, my best friend growing up was Mormon in the same small town in North Carolina. If you're ever in North Carolina, I'll take you over to the Pentecostals and let you get to meet them. It's a good time. Lasts all day. But it was always the idea of prophecy. You know, when you turn 16 in the Mormon tradition, you get you sit with the prophet, and they give you your prophecy. And I was always like, maybe I should convert, because I'd really like that prophecy.
Yeah.
There was some aspect of my personality that's always been attracted to that which can't be seen, you know, to the mysteries, always that unifying. Even in college, I was an art historian, and I even see that as part of it. Just always trying to find the signs and the symbols lying under it all that were speaking to me without. It's only in recent years that I've begun to see the whole thing crystallizing as like, oh, you're kind of an occultist. It was this, you know, it was you, or you're into mental causation, or all of this stuff sort of has worked its way into making me who I am, even as my cover story, the chef. You know, it's somehow
Right.
it even the philosophical aspects of it all even works its way into my kitchen. And
Dig.
yeah, I don't know. It's just I really appreciate your transparency with your own believing historian identification, and I'm just thankful for you to show up today and talk to us. It's been so interesting.
Thank
I'll
you.
give the floor to people.
Please. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was once in a Mormon temple, and it wasn't long ago, and there was a 16-year-old kid, and he was wearing white buck shoes. And I said to him, "Hey, Pat Boone." And he sort of looked at me, and I was like, "Oh, sorry, those are liturgical." I didn't, you know. So we had a gap in understanding culturally.
It does happen with the age difference.
And my lack of realization that he was wearing the white shoes as part of a liturgical practice, not because he was like thinking they were cool. So anyway, I'll meet him someday. Anybody else?
I'd like to ask a question.
Please.
Sort of on a similar but slightly different trajectory. One thing that I've encountered a lot, and what I am interested in, is that there's, because of this sort of enlightenment narrative around, you know, machine thinking and mechanical thinking, the sort of scientism of the age, I've also noticed that there's a tremendous suspicion and distrust for the occult in modern times, but it's in this interesting way where it's like people are tainted by having any kind of interest in it, and that there's like this sort of purity complex coming from this more scientific, very secular perspective. And I was just curious, like, do you agree with that? And what do you think about that? And what do you think that indicates about our modern situation?
I find, and this is so interesting, and it just speaks to human nature. I find that in terms of metaphysics, in terms of parapsychology, in terms of the occult, I find that when I'm talking to people who actually do come from the sciences, they are more liberal than people who come from the social sciences and the humanities. My biggest critic is a professor of anthropology at Kansas State University who seems angry, every time I open my mouth, and whereas I can talk to an engineer, I can talk to an MD, I can talk to a physicist, and everything is just fine. Because the closer you get to reality, the more messy you realize it really is, and the more truly like astounding the whole thing is. I mean, even if, for example, you have a physicist who thinks that, listen, all this business about wave states and particles and perceptual bases of reality, it's all wrong. It's all nonsense. But you talk to that same person and he or she will say, okay, if you square a wave state is the square root of probability. Okay, why should that be? I mean, that's absolutely bizarre. It's like mathematical infinity. But how? But how? But how? And when you push up against these things that we've been taught to accept, like gravity, I mean, gravity presumably is mass attracted to itself. And experiments have shown that even in the so-called vacuum of space, disparate objects are attracted to one another by what we call gravity. And I mean, never mind spooky action at a distance, or, mirror effects, or particles traveling backwards in time. Just dealing with like Newtonian age science, we agree, okay, this is real because it happens, because it repeats, because it can be observed, but it's crazy. We just have no idea why. Why should a wave state of particles, even if a person rejects the perceptual base of reality, why should that squared tell us the probability of where something is going to wind up? It's just really, I mean, you're almost dealing with the infinite in an equation, just like the golden mean, you could say, is the infinite in an equation. Why does a leaf grow that way? Why does a snail shell grow that way? From whence comes this symmetry? And it's all, I mean, you could say, well, it's just all chance, and that's that. And there are some materialists who say that. But then reality just keeps getting more complicated, and the so-called chance becomes less persuasive, and I suppose materialism as a philosophy, which holds that there's nothing outside of flesh and bone, motor skill, cognition, chemical processes, like that's it. I would say that philosophy has failed and it no longer holds up. But we're playing catch up, where for the next generation or so, Wikipedia and the New York Times and the kind of pillars of academic opinion are going to continue relying upon the materialist premise, which is that life creates itself from chemical processes. And that the question of going back to, well, what was before that? What was before the Big Bang? And, to them, that's just uninteresting kind of pondering, philosophizing. But the truth is, um, we've witnessed so much in terms of the perceptual basis of reality and our inability to really come to grips with the findings of particle physics, for example, our inability to come to grips with those findings without allowing for intimate outcomes that are selected by measurements. It's almost a logical necessity that you have to abide the existence of different dimensions or different intersections of time. And when you see in the field of neuroplasticity, a thought, whatever that is, a thought affecting brain biology, a continued thought redirecting the electrical pathways in the brain, you have to acknowledge that something called a thought does elicit some sort of a physical force on matter, which calls into question the existence of AI. Should it really be called intelligence? Because we don't understand what intelligence is. And I believe that materialism, physicalism, it just doesn't hold up. But that won't be coming to Wikipedia anytime soon, because there are people who have very deep abiding interest in those things, just like religious authorities, and they are not going to give up the reins of insistence that uh, anything that points to extra physicality is wrong. So, for example, and I'm working on a podcast about this right now, the evidence for ESP is overwhelming and replicable. But every skeptic who almost invariably is a science journalist or from the social sciences or humanities, every skeptic will say there's not a shred of evidence and there's nothing replicable. And they're wrong. And they don't know they're wrong because that's been so reinforced that it would be the equivalent of, I don't know, telling a pilgrim there's no God. It's not, whoops, it's not going to penetrate. And excuse me, this is why I get shatterproof glasses. And and so there's no room for that to penetrate, even though the evidence for ESP, for example, is just overwhelming and replicated, but our cultural organs can't take that in. And yet, look, the Princeton until recently had an ESP lab, and it's closed with the retirement of its founder, but its founder was the head of the engineering department. And that's, you could have a better conversation with somebody who's trained as an engineer or an MD than with most of the people who call themselves skeptics. So I'd say don't despair, because within the hard sciences, there is more openness to this than there might appear. There's also rejectionism, but that rejectionism is leavening, and you see it, and there are going to be switchbacks along the way. But you see it within the pages of Scientific American, where you'll find wilder articles and theses than anything I ever say. But there will also be cultural pushback against those things. There was a consortium of scientists who wrote a very good piece for Scientific American a couple of years ago about the existence of some transpersonal mind in conjunction with particle physics. And it's a very challenging piece and brilliant and wonderful. And I went back on their website several days ago to look the piece up, and it has like a warning disclaimer on it, like, that the magazine doesn't support the points of view expressed in this piece. So the piece was in there, and it's a really extraordinary piece. But then people must have complained, board members or friends of board members, and it got slapped with the equivalent of a warning sticker. So there's going to be progress, there's going to be switchbacks, but I have no doubt that it'll take a generation. But the grip of materialist philosophies, it's already loosening.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience as well, with more scientifically, like scientist people being more aware of the limitations of the scientific method, and then therefore being more open to certain things. But it's almost more like it's this sort of cultural milieu of, like, we in this house we believe in science, and without really fully understanding what they mean by that, and what does it mean to believe in science. And so that's the sort of interesting thing that I find. And then in conjunction with this sort of suspicion of the occult as being tainted by, say, like esoteric Hitlerism, or these types of things, that I thought was interesting that you mentioned in the book. But I don't want to derail the conversation. But
no, I one of the aspects that's so typifies human nature is that while the impact of the occult on Hitler was questionable, the impact of the occult on Gandhi was without question, and Gandhi wrote about it very forthrightly. But that's boring. That's boring. All Gandhi did was foment the largest democratic revolution in human history. But Hitler, that's interesting, and there's this prurient interest in violence, in kind of mass psychology, in war, in exclusivity, and you don't get that from Gandhi, but you get that from Hitler. And so the interest in that, I think, probably speaks to human nature.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Just to kind of continue what you're just talking about, while you're talking about the warning on that journal article.
Yeah.
It kind of had me thinking, I wonder if it's you think that it's because of the age of internet, everything's out there, so this journal is worried about having a bad reputation or something, right? But I don't know, I just reading through all of your accounts throughout history, it kind of made me realize that happened back then too. It's not just the internet, there's always going to be people who are afraid of these concepts and trying to shut them down. Do you think that the internet has made that a lot worse and harder for people to talk about these fringe ideas? I think that's something we all say, but I don't know if it's even true.
It seems to me the internet has created like velocity, like everything happens so much more quickly. So it's great because I could find a quote much more quickly, but then, you know, 10 strangers who use anonymous names could attack me for that quote if they feel like it. And it seems to me that we as a human community are not sufficiently mature enough to deal with what the internet has created, this unbelievably high speed 24/7 open mic. And it does make me worried, frankly, about AI because I don't think that we as a human community have the emotional maturity to deal with this stuff. It's like giving a 2-year-old, a go-kart. I mean, what do you think is going to happen? He or she is going to crash it. And to me, that's the internet. It's amazing, and I've benefited from it as we all have, but it's so dangerous as well. And I'm really personally convinced that if some percentage of us don't get ahead of this, the internet is going to do us in, because there's so much misinformation, there's so much hatred. And I'm not expecting that a majority of people are suddenly going to start behaving themselves, but is it too much to ask that like 2% will or 3% will? That may be enough to save us, It always has, so let's hope that continues.
Agreed. Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, thank you all so much. I mean, it's really been a pleasure, and I really appreciate you reading the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
It
Mitch.
was
We
super
appreciate you
informative.
writing it.
Yeah,
And
and stopping
I don't know,
by.
I don't know what I'm going to do with this video, but if I do post it, is that okay with everybody? I just wanted to make sure because okay. Thank you.
Yep.
I have one more comment, which is I would like to say that you've done a lot for the book industry by writing these books, because after reading this, I think I've ordered 10 more books in my Amazon cart.
Cool.
So Jason Liu, Carl Abramson, Blake, Milton.
Oh, sweet.
I have a lot of work to do.
Excellent. Let Bezos know, tell him. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mitch. I'll get in touch and send you the recording.
Would you please? I really appreciate it. Thank you. My
Totally.
email is on my website. It's just my name, horowitz.myc@gmail, but it's right on my website, the real thing.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well,
I
thank
really
you.
appreciate
Yeah.
it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right, y'all. Thanks. We'll speak
Bye.
again. Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye. Bye.
Bye.